wow, look at how the sun is lighting up this beautiful pink blossom, double blossom on this azalea here at Airlie Gardens on this beautiful spring day. Welcome to Cape Fear Critters. Today we are going to explore the garden and other locations in search of pollination in action. So we're going to be looking at different flowers here in the spring, and we've got a lot of activity there. And we're going to be looking for the animals that help to allow plants to reproduce by swapping pollen from one flower to another. So let's go out, get started, and go exploring on this pollination celebration. So here we are amongst some more azaleas, and when we look at these flowers, we see a lot of things coming out of the center of these flowers. And we know the blossoms are visited by animals like bees and butterflies, other pollinators, and they're in search of food. So they go into these flowers looking for nectar, but additionally there's also pollen in there, and some animals can digest the pollen, it has protein in it. But the whole process about pollination is having a flower attract an animal that will come in here and do work for free for the plant. The plant is willing to give a little bit of sugar as long as whatever pollinator, like a bee, which has a really fuzzy body, will go inside and get pollen stuck to its back. And if you look closely to these flowers, you'll see that all these things that are sticking out of the center are not all the same. There is one that is longer than all the others. And for this azalea flower, it's this pink little filament right here, and that is called the pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L, and at the bottom of that pistil are future eggs or seeds of more flowers. And the little things around the pistil are called stamen, and at the tip of the stamen are these little yellow things called anthers, and those anthers have pollen on them. The pollen has to go from the anther into the pistil, but sometimes that has to happen in another flower. So imagine a bee flies into this azalea flower trying to find food, and the flower is also communicating in some ways to the bee. We'll talk about that soon. But the bee gets in there, the fuzz of its body called setae is covered with pollen, then it moves to another flower, some pollen falls off, and voila! The pistil now has the pollen grain inside of it, and it can start to grow a seed. And it's the same thing at home. If you've ever grown a tomato, a blueberry, a squash, a zucchini, you'll know that always first you have the flower and then the fruit. Wherever the flower was pollinated, it turns into that fruit with the seeds inside. So spring is the perfect time to go and look at the variety of flowers and pollination techniques that are used by plants. Because remember, we've just come through the winter, everything was kind of dormant, but now the days are longer, the temperature's rising, so it's time to grow, and a great time for a lot of plants to set flowers and later to set seeds. So it's time for us to go look for more examples of such pollination. So here we are under the bough of this big live oak tree, and all around us right now the flowers of the oak tree are drifting around. There's pollen in the air. I've been sneezing a little bit. But the cool thing about this flowering oak tree, and yes, they make little flowers, they're not very colorful, but this plant, the oak tree, is habitat for other plants, including what we see growing here. This is a fern known as resurrection fern. It goes dormant when it doesn't have enough water. But as you can see with this patch here, which did receive some rain recently, it comes back to life, lush and vibrant, verdant, very green, and hence the name resurrection fern. Ferns are unique plants. They've been around for a very long time, since the time of the dinosaurs. Evolutionarily, these ferns have been around before plants made flowers. So how then did plants reproduce prior to having flowers? One technique or one approach these plants use you can find on the bottoms of the leaves here. This is what we're looking at, these dots are sporophytes, or the spore-producing parts of these plants that aid with the reproduction part of its life cycle. So some plants, they can grow by dividing, just vegetatively. Parts of the plant can move from one place to another. For example, we've got some Spanish moss here. A bird could tear off a piece of this Spanish moss, use it as nesting material, and in that way transfer it to another tree, and it starts to grow. So that's one way to reproduce vegetatively. Like ferns, you can use sporophytes, or like our flowers that we're going to be looking at, we can talk about reproduction through flowering seeds. And I've got a nice little model right here of an idealized flower. Not every flower looks like this. In fact, there's probably not one that looks exactly like it, but this flower shows us the key components of what's going on in a flower, just blown up a little bit bigger so we can see it. So again, here is the pistil, this thing in the middle. Inside of this pistil down here are the eggs inside, or the future seeds of another flower or another plant of this type. And what it takes is the pollen from these anthers over here to move into the pistil to aid in the fertilization. So the pollen grain will actually travel down this tube and eventually find its way into this chamber where it will help fertilize the eggs that are inside. And that's how these plants will reproduce. So how does the pollen move from here to there? We've talked about animals that help. It's not just bees, it's not just butterflies. There's moths, there's hummingbirds, there's beetles, there's lizards, there's anoles, and even the wind is a very important pollinator. In fact, that's how the oak tree here gets its pollen to move around, is with the wind. And I'm gonna set this down so we can take a look at these flowers here. So right now, these things right here are producing all this pollen that's floating around in the air. And then later on this year, we'll get acorns starting to grow in that area. So no flower is the same, but they all generally do a similar function with combining the pollen with the eggs and creating the seeds. But that's not the only way that plants reproduce, and hopefully we'll go look for some more, maybe some duckweed, which is a plant that divides vegetatively, just splits apart right on top of the water that it floats on. So let's keep going and explore more of the garden and see what else we can find. Welcome to the pergola garden. This wonderful walkway down to the water is really an arbor for a bunch of different vines. We have 3 species above us, the jessamine, jasmine, and the cross vine, which is blooming right now. The cool thing about this cross vine is the stamen and the pistil are pressed against the inside upper part, the ceiling of the flower. And so the idea is when an animal goes in here, and one animal that loves to pollinate this is hummingbirds, their beak fits perfectly in there. And when they go down in there to get the nectar, they get pollen rubbed on the front of their beak and the top of their head. And so that way, the next flower they go to, it rubs off and helps pollinate that flower. And above us too, not in bloom yet, is a flower known as jasmine, which is incredibly fragrant. And some flowers, they use that technique of having a certain aroma about them to attract their pollinators. For example, there's a fly known as a blowfly, which doesn't have really great vision, but a good sense of smell. And that particular fly might be attracted to a flower like the skunk cabbage, which has a stinky smell about it. Flies like to lay their eggs on dying or decaying plant and animal material, and a skunk cabbage kind of emulates that. And so here comes a fly, goes inside the skunk cabbage, pollinates it by moving around thinking that it's a good place to lay eggs, and then it leaves carrying the pollen with it to another skunk cabbage. So sometimes the smells can be very nice and sweet, sometimes they can smell bad, but the whole thing is that they attract the right kind of pollinator for that plant. And like we've been talking about today, different plants of different sizes will attract different pollinators of different sizes. Flowers, for example, that bloom at night are going to attract nighttime active or nocturnal pollinators. So the evening primrose, for example, is a nighttime or evening blooming flower, which would be a great source of food for an animal like a moth, a sphinx moth at night. That sphinx moth, which is nocturnal, would not be pollinating some kind of daytime blooming flower. So different pollinators for different flowers. Very exciting. Let's keep going. So what we have here is the world's smallest flowering plant known as duckweed. There's no flower on this right now, but this flowering plant can divide both just by separating and dividing these little leaflets in two. We call that just division, replication or reproduction through division. Or they can make a flower, make little seeds, but typically this is a plant that just divides and sits on the water, but it does make a flower, world's smallest flowering plant. And as you see, it floats on the surface of the water. And because of that, it doesn't spend any of its energy really investing in cellulose or lignin, which is what makes plants like this woody plant stick up straight and tall. This plant, since it carries all its weight on the surface of the water, has no need to have the hard, fibrous, carbon-rich lignin and cellulose. So it spends all its investment into making protein or fat and sugar. So those are really, carbohydrates is largely what's in here, and lots of protein. And so they call it duckweed because lots of ducks and swans like to eat it. Great food. Here we are in a very diverse set of blooms, a wildflower patch here at Airlie Gardens. And it's just remarkable. We're seeing all kinds of flying insects in here. Beetles like ladybugs. There's wasps in here, ichneumon wasps and paper wasps. There's moths and butterflies. Oh, there's a little skipper right there. We're also seeing bees, and bees are a very important pollinator. These pollinators, they can come in all shapes and sizes. Hummingbirds count, bats count, beetles, ants, all kinds of things. But the most valuable pollinator out here are the family of bees. And we've got lots of bees in North America. Over 4,000 species of bee live on this continent. And so the next time you're out in the garden and you see a bee, it may not just be a regular old bumblebee. It might be a carpenter bee. It might be a southeastern blueberry bee, a sweat bee. There's all kinds of bees in our backyard. And it turns out most of them live in the ground. 70% of bees in North America are ground dwelling. And what they need to survive is sometimes just a bare patch of earth. You can even compact it a little bit. A southward facing slope is good. They like a little warmth. And that's more sun that way. So generally a flat or gently sloping bare ground, that's what a lot of bees need. And what they're looking for in the ground, they'll tunnel into the ground, dig a kind of cavity in the soil, and that's where they'll leave their babies. They call it a brood. And they feed the little baby larval bees inside. That's where they go out and get pollen and nectar, and they bring it back and feed it to the baby bees for next year. And most of those species do live underground. 30% of our bees are cavity dwellers above ground. So they might live in a hive like the honeybee, but most of them live in dead trees, dead snags, and underhangs. So it's good to keep those dead trees around because that's a valuable resource for a lot of bees. And why do we need the bees? Well, they help pollinate things. If you've ever eaten a blueberry, a fruit of almost any type, you have bees to thank for a lot of that pollination. Everything from tomatoes to squash, pecans, almonds, all of those things require the help of a bee in order to pollinate it. And it turns out some bees are better at pollinating than others. And a lot of research these days, especially from our NC State University. They're finding out that a lot of the native bees are really better at supporting pollination of our crops. So we still want the honeybees, and still honeybees are a huge part of our agricultural system, but it's time to create habitat for our native bees who are happy to do the pollination job all by themselves as long as we give them a little space. Let's take a little exploration. We're going to head over to another facility where we're going to inspect a European honeybee hive. The European honeybee is not native to North America, but it is naturalized. And so we're going to learn more about that. Let's head out. So we've gone on a little field trip today, and we're visiting some friends over here on 23rd Street. This is Dave Sylvia with me here with Leading Into New Communities Link, and you're keeping a bunch of animals over here. Tell me about these animals, Dave.
Well, we have about 30,000 altogether.
Wait, say that again?
30,000 young ladies in various stages of development that are our beehives. We've been very fortunate. We have 3 healthy hives at this point, and we're hoping that they strengthen out through the summer and provide us with honey, but most of all, pollination.
Right, so you've got a metropolis of bees here, almost 30,000 individuals, and to sustain themselves, they need things to go pollinate, right? To feed themselves, they need nectar and pollen.
Absolutely.
So how do you help them? They're helping you. How do you help them?
Well, we provide them in the best conditions that we can to live and grow. When the times are tough, we have a sugar water solution that we help feed them for overwintering. During the spring, the pollen and the nectar are flowing. They go out and forage for themselves. The older stage, the 3rd trimester of bees, goes out and does the flights and the recovery of pollen and nectar, which the nectar is what they condense down into honey.
Ah.
So there's a lot of stuff happening. Busy as a bee has a lot of merit when you start working with it.
So nectar is not honey. You need to collect a lot of nectar and kind of distill it down in a way.
It's just like working with maple syrup up in Vermont.
Sure.
You know, the average bee, I think, takes 1/12 of an ounce in its lifetime of nectar. And you talk about a pound of honey, think about the operations for how many bees it takes to make that pound of honey.
Thousands of trips, right?
Thousands of trips. The bees live about 6 weeks. The first 2 weeks are tending inside the hive on cleaning and doing other tasks inside the hive, tending the queens, the larvae, etc. The second 2 weeks of flight lessons, and the third 2 weeks is forage time, and they work themselves to the point where they can't fly anymore, and the next set of bees come about. You know, the new hatches come out.
So it's all planned. They know what they're doing.
They know more about what they're doing than I do.
Huh. And we also saw some honeybees on the way over here collecting water to bring back to the hive. What was that about?
Well, they maintain throughout the year a hive temperature of 93 degrees.
Oh, so they maintain a constant temperature
Constant temperature of 93 degrees inside the hive. So what they do is they go out and bring back water to the hive and excrete it, and through an evaporation process, they're able to cool a hive down.
Sure, that's how you cool down a greenhouse, evaporative cooling. Wow.
Exactly.
And I find that fascinating because they're invertebrates. They're considered cold-blooded. Their temperatures can change, but they maintain for the hive because that's where the brood is, the baby bees. Wow, that's really fascinating. So these guys, you are also feeding off of some of the nectar on your crops over here. How does that help your crops?
Well, if you don't have the bees to pollinate the flowers, you're not going to get a harvest.
Ah.
It's absolutely crucial, and it's about 2/3, I understand, of the crops that we grow are pollinated by bees or other pollinating insects. So
for example, what kind of crops?
Squash
Squash
comes to mind, tomatoes, cucumbers, blueberries.
Oh,
In this area of North Carolina, blueberries are a big hit.
right.
And if you have no bees, you have no blueberries. Unless you want to get a cotton swab out, and that's not going to work well.
Oh, you mean actually go to each flower?
and pollinate that way, where you've got so many bees, they can go in and they do the pollination. They get a little nectar as their reward, and they take it back to the hive to grow.
Goodness. Well, Dave, I can't thank you enough for sharing this with us. We've been looking for a nice set of honeybees. And I guess I should mention too, the honeybee, this is the European honeybee,
This
correct?
is the European honeybee.
So it's not originally native here, but it's considered naturalized. What does that mean?
Well, the honeybee came because of when the Europeans came over to this country, to the continent, they wanted their sweet tooth satisfied. Therefore, they figured they'd bring some honeybees and they could continue the cycle of growing, cultivating the bees and producing the honey for their tea, etc.
So these guys make honey, but you also get pollination from other bees out here, right? Don't you?
Correct.
And
You've got the carpenter bees, or I guess they're also known as bumblebees, and there's a number of other bees that do pollinate.
Great.
But the biggest one is the honeybee.
Well, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, and I appreciate it. This has been fun, putting on this bee gear and getting out here, seeing the garden growing.
Come on
Thanks
out
so
anytime.
much.
You know you're always welcome.
All right,
This
will
is a good thing.
Oh, great, Dave. Well, we're gonna head back now and finish up our day of pollination. So thanks again, Dave, and next time you eat some honey, make sure you know all the work that's been going into that. All right, let's head out. So we're going to finish out today sitting under this wonderful oak tree and talking a little bit more about the hard work of those bees we just saw. Hives, just like the 3 we visited, produce this delicious honey right here. And local honey is a really cool thing because the flowers that the bees visited to make this honey, this was made in Wilmington by David Bridgers. It's also certified by the North Carolina Beekeepers Association. This honey here is great for Wilmingtonians because it has the local flora inside here, means that you can develop allergy resistance to a lot of the local plants just by eating this honey. So by using local honey, you can develop an immune system that can handle some of the local allergens. And so if you have a problem, like sometimes I get a lot of sneezes going on in the springtime, this kind of stuff can help you remedy that in a very natural way. One thing you can do if you want to become a local beekeeper is make sure that you get yourself on the do not spray list for vector control with New Hanover County. We do spray for mosquitoes because they can hurt people, but the same pesticides that we use there can hurt the bees. So if you're producing bees and honey, you can get the consent of your neighbors and get the attention of the county, and we can not spray there. So that way you can have healthy bees, just something to keep in mind. But today, I hope we've learned a little bit about how pollination happens and some of the great benefits we get from having habitat for our local pollinators, bees and butterflies, bats and hummingbirds, all these animals and more. They help to really produce the food we eat and sustain the wildlife that lives around us. So thanks for joining us on Cape Fear Critters and enjoying this day, this celebration about pollination.